in the 19th century. We are a bit late in this session, so we are just to begin it with Henriette Partzsch. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. A very long thank you to the organizers, and I will start without any further ado. This talk revisits a set of questions that has been occupying readers, writers, publishers, and critics probably for as long as there have been texts circulating beyond the immediate context of creation. What is the purpose of reading? Who has access to reading material? How does literature affect its readers? What do readers do with literature? Up to which point can readers be trusted? And which readers, for that matter? Very often these questions come to the fore when well-established gatekeepers of knowledge are confronted with new channels of circulation and demands for increased access to knowledge by previously marginalized groups, which is exactly what is happening in 19th century Europe with regards, for instance, to gender and class. In this paper, I will explore the circulation of reading material by and for women in the European literary system in the second half of the 19th century, looking mostly at Spain. I will start by illustrating the general problem of women's access to secular reading material with the help of the writers Emilia Pardo and Faustina Sáez de Melgar, before discussing the coming-of-age novel as a vehicle for shaping and modeling women's education in a way that clearly builds on enlightened ideas about education and literature. The last part of my presentation looks at the ways in which the circulation of coming-of-age novels by Fernán Caballero, Frederica Bremer, and E. Marlitt were shaped by a modernizing publishing industry in full capitalist expansion, with special attention to the controversial but unavoidable question of religion. Overall, I argue that the circulation of coming-of-age novels across linguistic and religious borders had the potential to crystallize a loose emotional community of women readers that would merit further study. Women writers and activists in Europe were acutely aware, as you have seen over the last days, that the access to recognized knowledge and education was a condition for their empowerment in society. Given that it was difficult for women to acquire a formal education in the 19th century, especially at higher levels, many women were self-taught to a certain degree. A more haphazard way of acquiring knowledge, this was shaped by the degree of access to relevant reading material, an issue that became an important factor in the ongoing struggle for women's education. The difficulties, but also the joy of the quest for reading material have been illustrated by the Spanish writer Emilia Pardo in her novel A Confirmed Bachelor's Memoir from 1896. Its young protagonist, Rita, very soon realizes that she needs to take her education into her own hands if she wants to lead a dignified and independent life. In her formerly noble, now impoverished family, proper schooling is reserved for the only son, despite his lack of intellectual capacity. Whereas the girl's education is limited to needlework, prayer, and household chores, with some additional music tuition. Like so many other autodidacts, Rita puts her trust in books and self-study. She reads everything she can lay her hands on, from mystic texts favored by one of the sisters, to best-selling novels borrowed from a family friend, and medical books sourced through a progressive doctor. Even Verlaine's poetry is part of a reading list, secretly obtained with the help of the sympathetic librarian, who does not care that Verlaine is deemed to be highly inappropriate for a young, unmarried woman. Only when Frida gains free access to a private book collection can she truly transcend the constraints imposed by gendered norms of access to book knowledge, and thus freely follow her passion for reading. However, many women in real life could only dream of such unlimited access to print material. Their battle was fought over the much more basic question whether reading was to be permitted at all beyond a very restricted religious canon. The situation is reflected in much of the discourse about women and reading in 19th century Spain, which I want to illustrate with excerpts from just one text from 1862 by Faustina Sáez de Melgar in her novel The Villains of Spain, or Secrets of the Capital City from 1862. I've chosen this particular text because Faustina Sáez speaks from her own experience when she advocates for reading material for women. Faustina's father, a liberal landowner from the region of Madrid, seems to have been hardly literate himself, according to a recent study by Virginia Silicoyan. Both of Faustina's parents embraced a traditional attitude towards women's education, which meant that Faustina could only fully develop her literary talent and professional ambitions after her marriage, which was apparently contracted without her father's consent. Faustina Sais was arguably the embodiment of a new reader, working hard to leave behind a background with very limited exposure to a contemporary literary culture in order to become an active professional in the world of letters. Faustina Sais de Megar's dedication of the novel to her brother-in-law illustrates the difficulties that had to be negotiated in order to convince a male head of family, as a moral and financial gatekeeper of a middle-class home, to understand that the very existence of stimulating reading material for his wife and daughters should be considered a basic need rather than a danger or simply something superfluous. While Sais agrees that the wrong kind of fiction should be banned, she also vindicates the access to, as she calls it, moral, sensible, well-reasoned novels as a necessity for Spanish daughters and wives, who in her words are otherwise reduced to, and I quote, turning time and again to the pages of the Christian Year or any other book of devotion, unable to influence or damage the underdeveloped talent of Spanish women, nor their impressionable hearts. The Christian Year, originally written by the French Jesuit Father Croiset at the beginning of the 18th century, remained indeed a bestseller throughout the 19th century, as has been studied. Available in a convenient format and with copious illustrations, its presence in Spanish homes speaks of a continuous practice of intensive devotional reading, which was apparently considered both safe and probably sufficient for untrained readers, such as women. This more meditative reading practice receives short shrift from Sais, who clearly advocates for more extensive reading as the only way to stimulate the intellectual, moral, and emotional formation of the next generation of women in Spain. A position probably influenced by the many boring hours she must have spent as a girl over texts that were too familiar to her, an experience which she must have felt had stifled her development rather than enhancing it. The solution to the problem, though, is not to demand full unsupervised access to all the treasures of the human mind, like Rita and Faro Bazan's novel. Instead, she takes a reformist approach and proposes to fill the gap by writing fiction that she sees as appropriate for the self-improvement of Spanish women, to ensure that the female public has books to read, which it lacks, and that by learning to love literature, it absorbs with pleasure the healthy maxims, the generous ideas that our Christian novelists pour into their tender hearts. What we have here is, of course, a rearticulation of the classical understanding that literature has three intertwined dimensions: instructing, delighting, and moving, toquere, delectare, movere. The claim is that Faustina Sais' readers will absorb healthy maxims and generous ideas provided by Christian novelists, so that covers the dimension of learning, enjoy the learning experience because they develop a love for literature and feel pleasure, dimension of delectare, and thus being emotionally moved in their tender hearts, which probably would have pleased Picot as well was here just now. So that's the dimension of moving, of movere. Another aspect which Faustina Sais does not mention here, but which goes hand in hand with her vision, is also the avoidance of coarse language, the decorum. Thus, Faustina Sais adopts and adapts the well-known principles of neoclassical literature to articulate a formula for novels that would accompany subaltern intensive readers on their way to becoming self-improving extensive readers, just at a time when proper literature is increasingly rejecting the particular mix of ethics and aesthetics, together with the promise of control over the imagination that it includes. The assumption that the text in question would channel the reader's imagination is, however, an essential condition for making more extensive reading acceptable to the more suspicious gatekeepers of good knowledge within a domestic setting. And indeed, the formula developed by Sais and similar writers proved to be very successful, and actually continues to be successful to our days if you look, for instance, at children's literature, which follows similar principles. In addition to achieving the aim of reaching at least part of the new target audience, writing novels in this adapted neoclassical style also opened professional opportunities for women writers who remained at the margins of literary culture because of their limited access to formal education, professions, and networking in comparison to their male colleagues. The fiction has been labeled as domestic novels, linked to the ideal of the so-called angel of the house as an emblem of femininity. However, for the purpose of today, I'm not interested in revisiting the question of the angel of the house. Instead, I want to explore the dynamics of these novels as coming-of-age stories which fictionalize the formative years of girls and young women, and thus the process of acquiring knowledge. The plots of these novels usually model different types and experiences of education and their results, potentially mirroring the reader's past or present struggles. Typically, the novels also include more explicit reflections on the advantages or disadvantages of different approaches to education. One Spanish writer who became indeed famous or infamous for filling her fiction with presumably healthy maxims and generous ideas, as well as very open attacks on any signs of liberalism, was Cecilia Villafare, alias Fernán Caballero. This feature is particularly striking in her novel Clemencia from 1852, which traces how the eponymous protagonist matures into a perfect Spanish woman. At the heart of this formative process are the lessons imparted by a wise and benevolent abbot, the uncle of Clemencia's dead first husband, who lives together with Clemencia's in-laws in their ancestral home in the Andalusian countryside. His teaching program is based on conversation, active aesthetical enjoyment of nature, and very selective reading, which nurtures the almost natural unfolding of Clemencia's talent and personality. The whole setup and the language used to describe the process have obvious echoes of Rousseau, and the good abbot guides Clemencia in a way that, and I quote, makes germinate in her the most delicate and exquisite seeds, like the spring sun that embellishes and brings forth the blossoms of a pleasant woodland. What fascinates me in Clemencia is the explicit weighting of the three intertwined dimensions of literature. I have highlighted so far the explicit inclusion of pedagogical content and reflections. It is indeed well known that the willingness to teach or to preach is very prominent in any piece by Fernán Caballero. Her narrative voice is never shy of telling her readers what they should think about any topic or character, and in Clemencia there are pages and pages of explicit teaching directly coming from the abbot. Nevertheless, Fernán Caballero was obviously a very intelligent writer, and she knew that readers do not necessarily remember details of content. The impact that she is trying to achieve, therefore, relies also on moving her readers, who may not remember specific maxims, but rather their own emotional experience of reading the text, how the text made them feel. In the words of the abbot to Clemencia, even though your memory may not retain a good read, do not think that you have lost its fruits, because you will keep the real advantage of the impression that it has caused you and the turn that it has given to your ideas. Because culture is not the result of retaining more or less, but of making good teaching more or less your own. And if we analyze Fernán Caballero's text less for their ideological positioning and more for their appeal to the emotions, there's plenty of fine nuanced material to find. The narrative voice itself is not detached, but always passionate in its interpellation of the readers, expressing anger, defiance, indignation, approval, or sadness in an almost ongoing commentary. At the level of the narrative content, special attention is given to the internal development of the main characters, what they feel, their bodily reactions, their understanding of their own emotions, the discrepancy between what they feel and how they present themselves to the outside world, the ways in which their emotions are noticed by others, up to which point they are understood or interpreted wrongly, and finally how feeling, reflection, decision-making, and action are linked. This approach is very much in line with Fernán Caballero's claim that in the prologue of Clemencia, according to which the novelist's domain is the analysis of the heart. What is more, enhanced fiction becomes an attempt at not only analyzing, but also educating the heart, with the main focus on an emotional religious dimension that she articulates as specifically Catholic and specifically Spanish. This emotional linkage between religion, nationalism, and gender also posits a sharp contrast between Caballero's text on the one hand, and on the other, novels translated into Spanish, usually from French, which were reputed to corrupt their readers. Faustina Sars had embraced this Viking-like view in the dedication that we have already looked at, blaming the translators for producing widely applauded monstrosities which relaxed the moral customs and society of forever Catholic and religious Spain. Just as an aside, Sars worked as a translator mostly from the French as well. This comment points towards another factor that complicates the question of availability of reading material for women, namely the influence of the book market on what materials circulated in which form, and how it was presented to the readers. In the 19th century, Spain's book market was relatively small and relied heavily on translations, mostly from French. Reading translated novels was thus indeed generalized, as Sars points out. Conversely, relatively few Spanish texts reached other European countries, contemporaneous Spanish texts. Interestingly, Caballero belonged to the rather short list of contemporaneous Spanish authors who were widely translated into other European languages, in her case including German, American, British English, French, Dutch, Danish, Hungarian, Polish, Portuguese, and Slovenian. Her fiction was also very prominent in the collection of Spanish language texts published and distributed in Germany by Brockhaus. This situation clearly shaped how her works were read outside of Spain. Her unique selling point was to be Spanish, and most contemporaneous critical commentaries about Fernán Caballero that have access so far indicate that what attracted readers to her was their pleasure in immersing themselves in a picturesque, pre-modern, supposedly authentic Spain, while many strongly objected to the omnipresent, moralizing framing of her fiction. This would suggest that not many readers turn to Caballero's books in translation to look for educational models, but rather because they are fascinated by Spanish identity. This element is, for instance, very strong in the very famous and influential review of Caballero's works published in 1861 in the Edinburgh Review. As you can see from this short quotation of a very long review, a quotation that refers to the group of novels to which Clemencia belongs. So Caballero's heroines are faded from extreme goodness and convent innocence of character. Yet the novels are redeemed from insipidity by some good portraits of both Spanish characters, and by here and there the graceful figure of a young, natural, lively, and high-spirited girl of true Spanish physiognomy. Consequently, many translators tended to adapt their versions of Caballero's works to the assumed taste of their target audience, typically explaining that they cut down on the verbosity of the original and left out passages that would only be of interest to a Spanish audience. One important factor that influenced their decision-making was without doubt religion, a fact commented by Cecilia herself in one of her letters to her brother-in-law, and I would like to thank Diana Arbaiza, who brought this letter to my attention. They sent me from Germany two gaviotas, one translated by Protestant, who, under the pretext that feelings are running high regarding religious questions, leaves out all religious things that the novel contains, consequently the best. But he translates better than the other, who is Catholic, who leaves nothing out, but who translates rather badly. In L'Indépendance Belge, a very renowned periodical, the Gaviota is published in French, but they too leave out all the most religious things. It's a scandal, what's a mess. The fate of Fernán Caballero's works in translation draws attention to a very interesting question. What happened when texts crossed religious borders, especially texts that embrace strong values, and they are likely to be read by people who are supposed to have impressionable hearts, like women and children? Fernán Caballero's experience shows that this was by no means a rhetorical question. In a period in which open political and cultural conflict between secularizing forces and Protestant and Catholic institutions in different constellations affected the whole of Europe, even though the articulation of this conflict depended on specific political and socio-historical contexts. The capitalist expansion of the print industry required publishers to grow their markets at home as well as abroad, for which they needed texts that were popular as well as ideologically safe for vulnerable readers and therefore highly saleable. However, popular coming-of-age stories by for women very often included religious references and reflections. In order to turn a profit by exporting them to new target cultures, the ways in which religious references shaped the didactic dimension of coming-of-age stories had to be carefully retuned. The case in question is the internationally best-selling Swedish author Fredrika Bremer, whose reception in Spain I've discussed elsewhere. An undogmatic but deeply religious writer from a Protestant background, Bremer was first presented in Spain as part of a pan-European movement of mostly women writers defending Christian values against the impious attacks of authors like Georges Sand. In Spain, Bremer's importance was compared to that of Fernán Caballero. This appreciation was possible because the novels contained very few descriptions of religious practices that would be identifiable as specifically Protestant. And apparently, Bremer's coming-of-age stories reached the hearts of Spanish women, if you can believe the writer Pilar Simoes de Marco, who claimed in an obituary for the Swedish writer that any feeling and thinking woman in Spain had a copy of Bremer's novel The Neighbors in her room. Nevertheless, Pilar Simoes still saw the Protestant Bremer as fundamentally flawed, because in her eyes, Bremer lacked an approach this clear and precise idea of God and the divine Redeemer who guides the pen of those of us who believe blindly and profoundly. Having said that, it seems that all those feeling and thinking women who had Bremer's book close at hand were not too concerned about this lack of orthodox inspiration. Although Simoes' criticism shows that texts that were perfectly acceptable in commercial Spanish mainstream culture could provoke demands for stricter adherence to Catholic orthodoxy, a dynamic to which I will return a bit later. But how did those popular coming-of-age stories circulate which did reference Protestant religious practices or even included explicit anti-Catholic sentiments? This description fits perfectly the works of one of the most widely disseminated women writers in Europe during the last part of the 19th century, the German Eugenie John, alias E. Marlitt, who became a publishing sensation in the late 1860s and 1870s, almost single-handedly converting the German family magazine in which her stories first appeared into one of the biggest players on the market. This was exactly the kind of success stories that publishers were looking for, and Marlitt's fiction was soon sold in different languages and countries, several of them with predominantly Catholic populations. Marlitt's text advocated for girls' education and opposed aristocratic privilege, as well as prejudice based on rank, blood, and family connections. Her young female protagonists have to learn to understand their own feelings while struggling with societies full of injustices that they have to right in their immediate context in order to arrive at the happy end of an equal marriage. The underlying conflict that shapes their development has often a religious dimension. For instance, The Old Mademoiselle's Secret from 1867 opposes a truly enlightened understanding of religion and humankind with a bigoted fundamentalist practice of Protestantism and exaggerated family pride. The Second Boy from 1874 makes full use of anti-Catholic sentiments with a Protestant heroine who suffers the intrigues of a villainous Jesuit priest and his accomplices. Thus, the underlying conflicts engage with contemporaneous political and social problems in Germany, but their novelistic function does only partly depend on the specific nature of the issue addressed. What the conflicts do above all is create a strong invitation to identify emotionally with the protagonist who occupies the role of the underdog in ever new versions of the Cinderella story. The emotional appeal of Marlitt's stories is indeed often remarked upon in critical commentaries, positively as well as negatively. The way in which Marlitt's fiction was translated into French provides an excellent example of this dynamic. In France, Marlitt's texts were first serialized in Emmeline Reymond's fashion and family magazine La Mode Illustrée, which catered for a similar audience to that invoked by Faustina Sales. During almost 4 decades, Reymond provided most of the content of the periodical herself. This enduring commercial success evidenced Reymond's deep understanding of her subscribers in terms of both their preferences in reading material and the boundaries that she could not transgress. Clearly, Marlitt was perfect material, otherwise it would be difficult to understand why Reymond translated and published every single story written by Marlitt. In her versions, Raymond strikes a very fine balance of changing just as much as necessary to remove any elements that could go against the values of her average reader, and thus startle them out of the immersion in the story by drawing attention to the text itself. In The Old Mamselle's Secret, she discreetly replaces with Catholic equivalences the few references to religious practices that identify the setting of the novel as Protestant. She also eliminates the practice of private Bible reading and changes a couple of unorthodox statements by characters who are clearly depicted as positive and thus potentially seen as role models. All in all, the interventions are only visible to somebody who knows the original text in detail. The second wife required more drastic measures, though, which is why in this case, Raymond openly addressed the need to introduce changes to make Margaret acceptable in France. She argues, in a note to her readers, that the translation, like a traveler in a foreign country, has to behave according to local customs. This is why she already had to adjust certain details in previous texts, because, and I quote, a literal translation would not have suited at all our tastes, or if one prefers our prejudices in France. The difference regarding the second wife is that Raymond sees the text as a contribution to religious partisanship, which seems to have disappointed her deeply. In her eyes, Margaret demeans herself by joining the persecutors in Germany, the Protestants, against the persecuted Catholics. A situation that she sets out to correct in her own version, which she feels is truer to Margaret's usual dislike of all kinds of oppressions than Margaret's own novel. Consequently, the Jesuits disappear from the French version of The Second Wife, and the religious denominations are inverted. The protagonist becomes Catholic, and her husband's family Protestant. At the same time, the religious dimension of the conflict is somewhat tuned down in comparison to the original, as Raymond does not or cannot substitute the hate figure of the Jesuit with a similar powerful fetish. To conclude, Raymond's translation would become the source text of most translations of Margaret into Catholic countries, including Spain. Incidentally, Raymond was very, very well known among Spanish women readers in the 1860s because of her regular appearance in the Spanish fashion magazine La Moda Elegante. Her translations of Margaret and the translations of her translations point towards an emotional community with transnational links that could form around the material circulation of coming-of-age stories by and for women. The creation of this community was predicated on the shared notion of the usefulness of reading as an activity that, properly channeled, would instruct, entertain, and move untrained readers, especially women and children, thus contributing to their personal development, often in the absence of or complementing rather basic formal education. This approach, clearly rooted in the Enlightenment, was embraced by the publishing industry of the 19th century in full capitalist expansion. The increased production and faster and more reliable circulation of physical copies made text more readily available, but these very conditions of circulation also shaped the commercial product that readers learned to expect. Ideological elements which may have worked within a source group required special attention when crossing borders. Religious elements could prove particularly controversial. On one hand, religion was seen as such an essential part of a woman's life that it was almost impossible to avoid it in stories that explored the development of young women. On the other hand, Europe's culture wars required caution because passionate expressions of partisanship could make the commercial viability of text in certain target cultures more difficult to achieve, both with the readers themselves but also with gatekeepers who continue to monitor text targeting readers with impressionable hearts. A kind of more diffuse religiosity seems to have worked well. It certainly allowed readers to immerse themselves in the emotional experience of reading without being challenged by disconcerting ideas. However, this approach, this tuning down, could mobilize more militant groups and individuals who regarded the bluntness of the lowest common denominator as an unacceptable concession, a reaction that starts to shine through in Villas-Sinoes's criticism of Bremer and would find full expression in some attacks by the French ultra-Catholic press on Margaret, but also in a Spanish partisan translation in an ultra-Catholic newspaper in 1896. Of course, another group who was quick to condemn Marlitt and company are literary critics and literary historians. They rejected the underlying formula, disputing the aesthetic value of what many of them saw as silly sentimental kitsch. Nevertheless, if you want to understand how literature matters to people and how it contributes to the circulation of different kinds of knowledge, in the past as well as today, we can learn a lot from the reading material for women in the 19th century. Thank you very much.